In December, London's Liverpool Street station was officially declared the busiest station in Britain. And you may ask yourself, well, how did we get here? It's time to look into the history of Liverpool Street. The station has its origins with a company called the Eastern Counties Railway. The ECR was built to connect East Anglia with London, with the support of railway promoter George Hudson, one of those Victorian figures who was half visionary genius, half ruthless conman. However, getting into London was the tricky part. Even back then, land in London was absurdly expensive. In 1840, they gave up. They terminated their railway in Shoreditch. The station was here, you can still see the ruins. Now, Shoreditch today is a hip and popular sort of place, but back then it was anything but. The area had high levels of poverty and crime. If you were a passenger, it was not an inviting place to walk. But you had to, if you wanted to get into the City of London proper. Nor were there many buses willing to venture out there. Nor was it a good place to unload goods. The roads were already crowded with traffic, without hundreds more carts heading into the city. The ECR desperately wanted something closer to the centre of town. In fact, from 1845 they were actively seeking a new site. One possibility had been raised. The City of London solicitor, Charles Pearson, suggested a grand central station in Farringdon where several railways could meet. This would have been approximately where City Thameslink is now, perhaps a little north. Unfortunately for Hudson, Pearson and co., landowners in the City of London were worried that railways would end up carving the centre of town up. In 1846, the Royal Commission on Metropolitan Railway Termini recommended no further railways in central London, which put the kibosh on Farringdon. Charles Pearson didn't give up, and eventually he would propose an underground railway, which, well, I'm sure you know how that turned out. Perhaps cutting their losses, in 1846 the ECR had Shoreditch renamed to Bishopsgate, which was a somewhat misleading name that did not reflect the station's location. The station was not only inconveniently located, but it was small. The ECR shared it with the Northern and Eastern Railway, and as traffic increased it was clear that more space would be needed. Trains were held up as they awaited their platforms. The station was rebuilt between 1848 and 1849, but this was only a stopgap. So too was sharing the London and Blackwall Railway's terminus at Fenchurch Street. In 1862, many of the East Anglian railways were merged to form a single company, with the ECR dominating. The new company was called the Great Eastern Railway, and one of their first priorities was the Bishopsgate problem. One possibility raised was to share a station that had been proposed at Broad Street. However, this was to be a joint venture between the North London Railway and the London and North Western Railway, and it seems unlikely that they could have accommodated a third company with the levels of traffic of the Great Eastern. In any case, the North London had no interest in sharing, and the negotiations failed. So the Great Eastern proposed 3 dedicated stations of their own. One was at Wormwood Street, one was at Finsbury Circus, and one was at Liverpool Street. Well, if you're watching this video, you've probably figured out which one received parliamentary approval in 1864. Liverpool Street posed some challenges, most obviously financial. Now, the Great Eastern Railway had more money to play with than the Eastern Counties, but it was still fairly poor as railways go. The area served by the Great Eastern didn't have much by way of heavy industry, and heavy industry, particularly mineral traffic, was what made the railways rich. By contrast, the Great Eastern had a lot of meandering lines serving largely agricultural areas. But land in London was expensive, really expensive, so raising the money took years. The other problem was geographical. The line into Bishopsgate was on a viaduct, but for whatever reason, the general manager of the Great Eastern, Samuel Swarbrick, pushed for a station below ground level. It's not clear why. The directors urged a street-level station, but Swarbrick overruled them. This meant a steep incline at the start of every journey from Liverpool Street. Possibly the idea was that eventually it would be able to connect with the Metropolitan Railway. Certainly some of the objections to other station proposals were that they couldn't do that. To get from Shoreditch to Liverpool Street would mean ploughing through some of the worst, most crowded slums in London. The Great Eastern were keen to frame this as a good thing for the benefit of the poor. However, just to help their consciences along, the Act of Parliament insisted that they provide cheap workmen's trains to the suburbs, and provide compensation for those made homeless. 450 tenement buildings would be demolished and 7,000 people displaced. The arrangement worked well enough for some, but for many the compensation wasn't enough to enable them to move to the suburbs. Instead, they were crammed into the remaining slums. So, for some residents, life got better, but for those most in need, life got worse. The station itself was built on the site of the Royal Bethlehem Hospital, better known as Bedlam, which moved out to a building in Lambeth that now houses the Imperial War Museum. As a temporary measure, the Great Eastern opened a new station at Bishopsgate under the existing one, called Bishopsgate Low Level. Along with permission to build Liverpool Street, the company had received approval for lines to Edmonton, Palace Gates and Chingford, which were ready before Liverpool Street, so there had to be somewhere for those extra passengers to go. Bishopsgate Low Level lasted from 1872 until 1916. Liverpool Street Station was opened in two parts, the first in 1874 and the second in 1875, which gives you some idea of how long it took them to find the money. They hadn't been helped by the collapse of Overend Gurney and Company, a financial institution that had enormous stakes in many railway companies, including the Great Eastern. Furthermore, they had drastically underestimated the costs of construction by something in the region of 2/3. The company was brought to the edge of bankruptcy, and it was only a management shake-up that restored confidence. The company also applied to Parliament for the right to charge higher fares into central London. After all this, plenty of sceptics believed the station would never make its money back. But they were soon to be proven wrong. The station was designed by Edward Wilson, who was an engineer rather than an architect, and didn't seem overly concerned with ornamentation. Consequently, it's not the fanciest station, but it has a truly wonderful roof. Aesthetics aside, it also suffered from the fact that while Wilson knew how to design a train shed, he was not so hot in providing what we might call crowd flow. This would cause headaches for more than a century. Also causing headaches was the fact that the platforms were numbered somewhat bizarrely. For example, there were 2 Platform 7s and 2 Platform 8s. Liverpool Street did get a connection to the Metropolitan Railway, and in fact the Met used Platform 1 at the mainline station for a few months in 1875, while their own station was under construction. Although, oddly, the Metropolitan station was called Bishopsgate rather than Liverpool Street until 1909. That station is a complex subject in itself and probably deserves a separate video. If you really want to show that you mean business, both literally and figuratively, your big city station needs a hotel. The Great Eastern Hotel was completed in 1884 to the design of Charles Edward Barry, grandson of the Charles Barry who designed the Houses of Parliament, and was rather more ornate than the rest of the station, an ideal place for the long-distance traveller to get their head down for the night. The lower floor of this building is now the Wetherspoons pub. The hotel had its own ghost train, or rather there was a late-night train to the sidings under the hotel that the staff referred to as the ghost train. Later additions to the station, which may or may not also count as a cult depending on your superstitions, were a pair of Masonic temples put in 1902 and 1912. Suburban commuter trains were the making of Liverpool Street, and indeed of the Great Eastern Railway. The cheap fares mandated by Parliament made commuting by train very attractive, and those trains became the company's most profitable. These half fares were nicknamed warehouse tickets by staff, since warehouse workers were some of the major customers. Cheap commuter services were expanded beyond the mandate, and the passengers were there to fill them. So much so that the station was soon operating beyond capacity. In 1884, the chairman stated that Liverpool Street required 25% more space to live up to its potential. 10 years later, work was finished on an eastern extension that included additional tracks dedicated to suburban trains. This gave Liverpool Street a total of 18 platforms, which made it the largest station in London until it was overtaken by Victoria in 1908. In 1897, all-night train services to Walthamstow were introduced, and staff nicknamed the passengers burglars. By 1907, Liverpool Street was seeing 851 passenger trains a day, and by 1912, around 1,000. The cheap trains did have their disadvantages. For one thing, the morning trains ran very early, often considerably earlier than the businesses their passengers worked at. So the commuters would linger in the station, perhaps having a bite to eat as they did so. This often consisted of herrings that they would cook in the waiting room, stinking the place out and offending the sensibilities of the refined traveller. Actually, snobbery was one of the big obstacles in the way of extending the hours for workmen's trains. The wealthy folk of Victorian London did not like the idea of sharing the station with the so-called lower orders. If I might just return to the concept of the station extension, the company were obviously more confident about the east side of the station than the original building because they put the company architect W.N. Ashby in charge. However, they did run into a bit of a hiccup due to the intervention of Parliament. Paying insufficient compensation to displaced residents had been a dirty trick, and this time Parliament insisted that the Great Eastern pay for new, modern blocks of flats to house those forced out by the extension. Which they did. But the station was at risk of becoming a victim of its own success. The fact that the station had been built in two sections would, in the long run, become disruptive. The two sections were connected by a single footbridge, which was far from ideal in rush hour. Trains were becoming so crowded that even at maximum frequency they were unable to cope with demand. The solution would have been to invest in electrification. Electric trains can accelerate and decelerate much more quickly than steam trains. But that would have been more money than the Great Eastern was willing or able to spend. At the same time, the 1890s saw the arrival of tube trains and a number of promoters who figured that if the Great Eastern wasn't going to pick up the surplus passengers, perhaps a new line could. The Great Eastern had a catch-22 situation where if they paid for electrification, they'd be spending more than they could afford. But if they didn't, they'd be handing their most profitable services over to other companies. Their solution to this Gordian knot was, in 1902, to build a hefty locomotive known as the Decapod, which would have the power to accelerate at the same speed as an electric train. Frankly, it wasn't a very good engine. It was too powerful for existing rolling stock, and too heavy for existing bridges. But it was enough to convince Parliament to quash plans for tube lines competing with the Great Eastern. In 1912, though, a tube line did make it to Liverpool Street in the form of the Central London Railway, now the Central Line. But this worked in the Great Eastern's favour, as it gave Liverpool Street a link all the way to the western suburbs of the city at Shepherd's Bush. The Great Eastern considered once again the concept of electrification, even giving serious thought to the idea of a tube line of their own from Liverpool Street to Goodmayes. But this didn't get any further than a concept. Of course, commuters weren't all that Liverpool Street handled. From the 1890s, the Great Eastern were very proud of their luxurious boat trains to Harwich, which meant that passengers could buy a ticket from Liverpool Street to Hamburg, Gothenburg, the Hook of Holland and Antwerp. Also popular were their seaside expresses, which could boast fine dining in their restaurant cars. The First World War was disruptive to all the railways of Britain, but Liverpool Street would become the victim of an air raid on the 13th of June 1917, with 2 trains being hit. 15 were killed and 16 injured. In 1922, a memorial to the Great Eastern Railway staff killed in the conflict would be unveiled. The Decapod gambit had paid off, but it was clear that the Great Eastern would have to find some way to up their game. In 1920, they announced what was officially known as the Intensive Service. This was one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of commuter rail, and required an incredible amount of coordination. Trains would come in, and almost as soon as they had stopped, another engine would come in and be coupled onto the rear of the train. The engine at the front would be uncoupled, and the rear engine would take the train out again. Then the front engine would be prepared to pick up another incoming train. New tracks and platforms were provided so that trains and engines wouldn't get in each other's way, and routes were given strict track and platform allocations to avoid traffic jams outside the station. To speed things up on the passenger side, clutter was removed from the circulating areas of the station with the demolition of offices and a bookstall. Carriages were painted with colour-coded stripes to indicate where the train was going and where the different classes of compartment were. This colourful signage led to the Intensive Service getting its much more familiar nickname, the Jazz Train. All this meant that a train could be turned around in as little as 4 minutes, which is good going even by modern standards. And it's all the more impressive given that this was long before the age of modern electronics. when so much was done mechanically and by eye. In 1923, the Great Eastern would become part of the London and North Eastern Railway. This was the grouping in which the major railway companies of Britain, and most of the minor ones, were organised into four huge companies, nicknamed the Big Four. It was hoped that this would enable the profitable lines to prop up the less profitable lines. Unfortunately, the LNER rather got the short end of the stick, because of all the companies they took over, the only one that was really profitable was the North Eastern Railway. Consequently, they didn't have much money to play with, and so Liverpool Street remained pretty much as was, with only minor improvements. Another underground service arrived in 1927, but not one you'd have ridden on. Well, not legally. This was the Post Office Underground Railway, a driverless tube train providing a postal service between the city and parts of the West End. The Liverpool Street section closed in 2003, but it is now possible to take a ride around Mount Pleasant on this most unusual railway. It was clear by the 1930s that things couldn't go on as they were. Even with the Jazz service, there were more passengers than the trains could handle. The LNER made vague promises of electrification and used this as justification to veto new tube lines in North London. But it was pretty clear that they weren't going to actually do anything about it, and so the powers that be stepped in. In 1935, the New Works programme was announced. This was a huge programme of investment in London's transport, only some of which is relevant here. Under the programme, the Central Line would be extended to Stratford and take over the branch line to Ongar and the Fairlop Loop. The government would also supply necessary loans for the LNER to electrify the line to Shenfield. The programme was delayed by the Second World War, but the Central Line aspect was completed in 1947, and the Shenfield bit by 1949. In the lead-up to the war, the station found itself a key link in the Kindertransport, the evacuation of Jewish children from Nazi-controlled territory, and in 2003 a sculpture was unveiled in commemoration of this. The Second World War was rather more eventful for Liverpool Street than the first, with several bombing raids hitting the station. In one case, a bomb struck the viaduct leading into the neighbouring Broad Street station, resulting in a goods wagon ending up on the roof of Liverpool Street. It had to be dismantled before service could resume. Meanwhile, the tube station became an important, if unofficial, air raid shelter. In 1948, the LNER became the eastern region of British Railways, the nationalised railway network. Under BR, electrification continued, and a programme of winding steam services down began. By 1960, the commuter services out of Liverpool Street had been fully handed over to electric traction, and what wasn't electric was diesel-hauled by 1962. With the end of steam, British Rail took the opportunity to clean the station up and modernise it, with rebuilding works completed in 1965. Despite investments, the nationalised railway network was expected to make savings wherever it could, and the old railways in East Anglia that had once been operated by the Great Eastern and its constituent companies were pruned back at the behest of Dr. Beeching. Back in London, British Rail had big and controversial plans for Liverpool Street that were announced in 1973. While there had been improvements over the years, the fact was that it was not ideal at a basic structural level. Therefore, the station was to be demolished, as was Broad Street next door, and the two stations moved to a completely rebuilt, completely below-ground station. Office blocks on top of the site would make the station pay. But the development faced strong opposition, led by the poet Sir John Betjeman. Also opposing were students of University College London, the London Borough of Hackney, and the Greater London Council, who argued that in addition to the architectural damage, the new plan involved a lot of office space for an economically uncertain time, and no housing. UCL put forward a more heritage-friendly alternative. In the face of all this, and following a 1977 inquiry, BR had to return to the drawing board. The reworked plan involved restoring and extending the train shed to the south, and replacing the roof of the eastern end with an office block. This compromise version was approved, and work began in 1985. However, Broad Street was to be the sacrificial lamb, closing down in 1986 and being replaced with the Broadgate complex. A junction with the old North London line was built, allowing the Broad Street trains to run into Liverpool Street, which is an ironic reversal of the Great Eastern's 1862 proposal to share Broad Street. In 1991, the new Liverpool Street station was complete. On the 24th of April 1993, the station would once again suffer bomb damage as a result of the Bishopsgate bombing by the IRA. This caused major damage to surrounding buildings, including Liverpool Street. There were 44 injuries and 1 death. Between 1994 and 1997, the railways of Britain were privatised. In 2015, though, TfL would take over a number of services. The commuter lines to Chingford, Cheshunt and Enfield Town became part of the Overground, an initiative to once again revamp the suburban railways of London. TfL also took over the service to Shenfield, but this was part of a much larger scheme, Crossrail. This was a scheme to build an east-to-west rail corridor beneath London, linking suburban lines on both sides of the city. The line to Shenfield was to become part of this. Liverpool Street would gain a couple of huge new platforms far beneath the station that were so long that they actually had a direct connection to Moorgate, the next station along the Metropolitan line. The new line opened in May 2022. Later that year, once again, new developments were announced, the most drastic since the 1980s. This was a plan to, once again, put an office block on top of Liverpool Street. And once again this was opposed by heritage activists, who argued, once again, that it would be damaging to the historic structure, including demolition of the historic roof, and that it's foolhardy to build office blocks at a time of economic uncertainty. The developers argue that they will largely be affecting the 1980s sections and will approve accessibility and circulation around the station. Which side will win remains to be seen at the time of recording. The arrival of the Elizabeth line has made Liverpool Street Station busier than ever, and it once again took the crown of busiest station in Britain late in 2023. Really, isn't that just the history of Liverpool Street all over? A station that was built to take advantage of a perceived market for city commuters that has spent most of its life being overwhelmed by those same commuters. And now, yet again, it's the busiest of all. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I would like, as I so often do, to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your kind support. You are the eastern extension to my inadequate terminus. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio!